Hi, my name is Renee DeWolf. I'm a senior data scientist here at Appriss, and today's session is called Hey Siri, Do Mobile Wallets Cause More Risk? In terms of objectives for the session today, we'll be discussing near-field communication, particularly as it relates to mobile payment technologies and the creation of payment card tokens. We'll look at how those payment card tokens impact the building of payment card account histories for fraud examinations. And we'll discuss link analysis and how it can be used to reunify payment card histories that have been split by these mobile wallet transactions. Start with some definitions. What we're talking about today is contactless payments, but we're specifically talking about the type that utilize near field communication, things like your Apple Pays and your Google Pays. We're talking specifically about those technologies that can be used in a brick and mortar location, so not technologies like a Venmo or a PayPal that are specifically used online or in e-commerce transactions only. And we're also not talking about technologies like a Starbucks or a Walmart Pay, where there might be a QR code or barcode that's scanned within a proprietary app. So let's get into how a mobile wallet app like Apple Pay works under the hood. Many of you have probably already done this. You can add any of your payment cards to Apple Pay with either a manual entry or a scan. And what happens when you do that is Apple actually passes that card to the appropriate card network. So a Visa, a MasterCard, an American Express. That card network validates the card with the issuing bank. And in the case of Apple Pay, the card network works as the token service provider. So they create a new token for that card, for that payment account number. And for the purposes of Apple, it's actually called a device account number. And that token is sent back to Apple servers and it's stored in your iPhone or in maybe your Apple Watch in what's called the secure element. So actually, if you look in your Apple Pay on your device, then you can see, a truncated version of your device account number, and that's a representation of the token that has been issued for the payment card that you added to Apple Pay. So what happens when you use that mobile wallet to actually pay for a transaction? Well, the transaction is processed using near field communication and most commonly at this point in time with what's called the EMV spec. So what happens with that is that a dynamic cryptogram is sent to the payment processor, and that goes along with this new device account number, that token, and other required information to process the transaction. So information about the transaction itself. So those three elements get passed to the payment processor in order to adjudicate that transaction. So it's a dynamic cryptogram. It is your device account number or the token that has been issued by the token service provider when you added your payment card to your mobile wallet application. And it's the actual information about the transaction that needs to be adjudicated. So those three elements will be passed together. Now, the dynamic cryptogram is probably, the portion of this transaction that you've heard about that is sort of like the one and done. This is a, a number that is associated specifically with that transaction only. So it is unique to that transaction. Your device account number, on the other hand, that is a token that is associated with your card itself. So your dynamic cryptogram, it will not have persistence. It will not carry over from transaction to transaction as far as an identifier of you as a consumer. But the device account number, that token that represents your payment card number, that number will be persistent across transactions. In terms of, a little bit of background on EMV and the NFC, they're complementary technologies. So EMV is just payment standard, and NFC is just the technology that allows your iPhone or your Apple Watch to communicate with an EMV-enabled payment terminal. Um, so Applications like Google Pay, they work very similarly to Apple Pay. There are some slight differentiations in terms of consumer visibility to the device account number and who acts as the token service provider. But for the most part, Google Pay and Apple Pay function very similarly. And if you really want to get sort of like dig down into the technical specifications of each of these, there is pretty extensive documentation, particularly with Apple Pay available through their developer pages. So why is all of this important? Well, for some time now, the Federal Reserve has been telling us that cash is no longer the preferred method of payment here in the US. In fact, more than 70% of us have at least one credit card. And even prior to COVID, even prior to the pandemic, the global mobile wallet payment market was already forecast to reach 3.7 trillion by 2024. So this is an area that was already in high growth, and COVID sort of, threw some accelerant on that fire. At this point in time, the latest projection that I've seen is that the mobile wallet payment market is forecast to reach almost 9 trillion by 2027. And it probably will come as a surprise to no one that Apple Pay, Google Pay, and Samsung Pay were among the most popular mobile wallets in 2020. Um, and I am talking specifically about, mobile wallets that are using, NFC there. Again, we're not talking about, there are some very popular mobile payment apps like, your Starbucks and your Walmart Pays that are not included in there specifically because their contactless method is a little bit different. When we go to look at our own data to identify and assess some of these trends, one of the things that I also like to do is sort of look outside Appriss in terms of what the broader market is putting out as far as signal is concerned with trends. And so what we did see is that in October of last year, the Blackhawk Global Commerce team reported that they were seeing mobile wallet adoption jumping as a result of the pandemic. And in fact, the numbers that they reported were 38% utilization pre-pandemic to 55% as of October when they released that report. And we put out our report in 2020 based on an analysis of our own global retail database, and that contains transactions from approximately 300 retailers, about 65 billion transactions. So before we get into the results from our analysis here at Appriss, I wanted to talk a little bit about how we conducted the analysis. So in addition to actually pulling data from our global transaction database, what we did is we combined this with in-store audits and transaction tracing. So this was kind of one of the more fun analyses that we've did, because whenever you ask your team to go into some of our retail clients and their task is to do some shopping, you don't get a whole lot of objections to that. So what we did is we did go into some of our retail client transactions, and we made some purchases. And we made some purchases using a variety of different payment methods. So we included some purchases that were made using mobile wallets like our Apple Pays and our Google Pays. But we also made some purchases using our cards in, normal chip and pin type transactions. And then we also did some tap to pay type transactions. And so what we did is we kept record of all of the transactions that we conducted, all of the shopping that we asked our team to do during the course of this analysis. And we tracked and traced those transactions through the data streams that our clients were sending us. And what this helped with was in our identification of how the differentiating factors in those transactions in the point of sale transaction data that our respective clients were sending us. And so what we did find during the course of that assessment is that there were some things that many of our retailers had in common as far as how they were sending us this data. And there were some where we had some of our retailers that had some very unique circumstances happening with their own types of proprietary contactless payments that required us to have a little bit more in our own data management of the data to sort of set aside our pure mobile wallet transactions, our things that were happening in like our Apple Pays and our Google Pays from other types of contactless payment methods that were occurring within those particular retailers. So insofar as some of the things that we did observe with our retailers that they had in common, probably what was most prevalent across the board is that regardless of how a payment was transacted, we did not see, mobile wallets per se reflected as a unique tender type within our retailer customer bases. So, for example, if we were to conduct a transaction using our Apple Pay with a card that was a MasterCard, and we were to conduct another transaction with a card that was a MasterCard using chip and PIN, in the majority of our data feeds, the tender type for that particular transaction would come across as MasterCard. So there would be no differentiation of, one comes across as a tender type of MasterCard, but, then the other one would come across as a tender type of Apple Pay. That was not how we typically saw the data coming across. Now, there were some sort of non, mobile pay, Google Pay exceptions to that. We did, for example, in some of our retailers observe that things like PayPal they do in fact, have some distinct tender types for those types of payment methods. So there are some non-traditional methods of payment that might be considered more of a contactless solution that might have a distinguishing tender type. But for the most part, that was not our observation in our retail client data. So that was not a method in which we, used to distinguish what transactions were contactless and which were not. The other thing that we did observe is that in terms of lack of consistency is that not all of our retailers do pass us the dynamic cryptogram. Um, so we did find in some of our retailer feeds that we do get that. And because we do get either the dynamic cryptogram itself or an indicator that the transaction included a dynamic cryptogram, that was a useful indicator for us in terms of being able to parse some of these transactions and identify which were contactless and which were not. So we did do some work, and we think that there is probably still some more work to be done with our retailers and with the feeds that they send us as to the best mechanisms to identify all of these different types of contactless payment solutions. And it really depends upon, the individual retailer as to how difficult some of these things are, how more or less difficult some of these things are to parse in terms of contactless subcategories. So there may, in some of our retailers, this might be the only, real type of contactless that they will see. But we did have some other retailers that they either have their own proprietary contactless within apps, or they have other mechanisms of payment that are considered by the retailer itself to be a contactless type of payment method. And I can give you an example of that. A few of our retailers have proprietary payment cards. They have private label credit cards. And in some of these retailers that have private label credit cards, they also allow the ability for a consumer to come into the store and not have their physical card on them. And they're able to do a lookup of the payment card for them to transact under that private label credit card. And what we did find in some of our data streams is that when that occurs, when that lookup of a card occurs for one of these private label credit cards, in some cases that transaction is labeled by the retailer as contactless. Now, obviously, it's a different type of contactless versus what we would consider to be a mobile wallet. So these are all differentiators where we think that we've done probably a pretty thorough job of actually tracking and tracing transactions through a variety of our retailers um, to be able to make this data as clean as it can be in terms of distinguishing these transactions to make this data meaningful. Um, uh, this is probably still an area where there's more work to do. So that being said, let's talk about how some of the numbers look. The first thing that we did is subset our database to specifically examine our US retailers who were classified as essential. And the reason that we did this is because, we did have a period of time when our non-essential retailers were completely shut down. So, they therefore would not be processing in-person transactions during those periods of time. But what we wanted to see is whether or not the retailers that remained open, those that were classified as essential and remained open to consumers for brick and mortar transactions, whether we could identify, any additional hesitation in the consumer base in terms of utilizing cash tenders or migration into other forms of tender as a result. So, and in fact, we did see that. We did have, quite a drop in the utilization of cash during that COVID store closing period. And at its lowest point, cash payments were about 15% lower than they had been prior to the shutdown period. Now, we did see coming out of that COVID closing period some level of recovery, but we did not see that recovery in cash payments climb back up to the level where it had been prior to those shutdowns. So we did find sort of a lower level of support coming out of the closure period. And just to ensure that what we were looking at wasn't simply an effect of, an overall decline in transactions generally and not just those specific to cash payments, we also did look at sort of the other side of the equation as far as our debit and credit card tenders. And it did reflect, the migration of transactions from the cash tender type to the debit and credit tender type. We did see sort of like an inversion of that curve where our cash payments dropped and our debit and credit tenders increased during that same period of time. So what we did next is we looked specifically at those categorized as these mobile wallet payments. And what we saw was, we don't have that same sharp curve. What we saw was both a curve that was both more pronounced and more elongated. And so what I mean by that is that the adoption of mobile wallets was sharper and percentage wise, but it took consumers a little bit longer to get there. So it took consumers a little bit longer to get from maybe cash to their typical, hard card, credit and debit transactions to mobile wallets. Um, and at its height, the mobile wallet utilization was up almost 88% versus where it had been prior to the shutdown of non-essential businesses. So overall, what we're seeing is that COVID accelerated mobile wallet adoption that was already on the rise. We reported this in July. Blackhawk reported it in 2020, both based on our respective, large volume transaction databases. Now, what we were able to identify through the analysis that we did of our own both in store and from our transaction database is that what happens when we add payment cards to these mobile wallets is that they do create a second tokenized representation of that payment card. So effectively, we are splitting an account history record into at least two components if a consumer uses Apple Pay. So I may have a Visa ending, 6273, and that is the tokenization representation for that card when I go in and pay using a normal chip and PIN transaction or even a tap to pay transaction. We did find in some of our in-store tests that tap and pay and chip and pin, they both, represented the same tokenized version of that card. But that token differs from what I received back in my data stream if I take that same payment card, that same Visa that was ending in 6273, and now I use that card in a mobile wallet transaction. And so instead of getting a token back that is, a token ending in 6273, I may now get a token back that is a token ending in, say, 3481. And that is specifically because the addition of that card to the mobile wallet creates that separate device account number, that second tokenized version of the card. So what that essentially means is that if I would like all transactions related to an account history for that Visa card, there are now two tokens that I need to pull up related to that account history and not simply just the one. There are some additional consumer behaviors that we believe may create some even more splits of the payment account history just by generating additional new tokens for that same card. And there's still some work to do in testing some of these out in the field, but some of the ones that we have been looking at include, what happens when, consumers remove a card from their mobile wallet and then add it back again. It does not necessarily receive the same device account number during the second addition of that card to the wallet. But for the most part, what we did find, again, was that while the dynamic cryptogram that is generated as part of these mobile wallet transactions, that while that is unique to every individual transaction, this device account number does have persistence from transaction to transaction, just like any other tokenized version of a payment card that we would get in other transaction histories. We think probably several areas of the retail business face additional risk or uncertainty, and this is just generally true whenever our consumer behavior can be more easily split across multiple tokens. So mobile wallets just provide a new and growing avenue for this, but it raises some risk with our return adjudications. So it creates, another account number that our linking processes through Verify need to bring into a broader consumer history, which fortunately we're able to do using those linking processes that we already have in place today. It creates some potential for customer service inquiries to become more challenging to resolve. Anything that is dependent upon, a retailer's customer service group being able to pull up the transaction history related to a specific payment card. There now may be some blind spots to exactly, what that payment card's full history may be if the mobile wallet device account number is not also being taken into account. And this is also true for anything that may relate to, loyalty or marketing consumer incentives based on a consumer's purchase history. So if a consumer's purchase history is being based on interactions with any one individual card, then of course, there is some potential for the mobile wallet transactions to be left out of that as well. And then, of course, wherever there is some changes in how our payment structures um, occur through the point of sale, there is always some opportunity for our employees to find ways to exploit that any blindness that may be present in terms of gaps between, SOPs today and how the data is currently being captured and monitored. At the end of the day, as an investigator or an analyst, you just can no longer assume that you're capturing all of the transactions associated with any one payment card by running just that one account number or the tokenized representation of that one account number. Whenever it is the case that there is a possibility that a consumer may have paid for some of their transactions through using one of these mobile wallet mechanisms, there is a possibility that there will be additional device account numbers associated with that card in order to understand the full account history. So again, what this does is it creates some need to be able to sort of reunify all of these tokens and create a more consolidated view of consumer behaviors. So this is something that we're already doing today in the context of how we do link analysis within our return solution. And so within that solution, we utilize link analysis so that multiple payment card histories and really multiple identifiers of a consumer can be attributed to that same consumer using this network type analysis. And essentially what it does is it looks at every transaction for consumer identifying marks and consolidates the consumer record based on overlaps that it finds. So this can help mitigate some of the risk because it's already a proven method of consolidating multiple payment card transactions under one consumer view of consumer behavior. And so what I mean by this is essentially if we are given a set of 3 transactions that were done by the same customer, and the first one had one payment card number in it and a loyalty card, and the second one had another payment card in it and a loyalty card. And by the way, these 2 cards today, with the way that these mobile payments work, even though one is 6273 and one is 2383, these could be the same card. These could be 2 transactions done with the same Visa, but one was done with a mobile wallet and one was done, say, with a chip and PIN or with a tap to pay. And then you have a third transaction that doesn't have the loyalty in it, but it has one of the 2 payment cards. Well, if you were looking at, running an account history, there is no one account on any one of these 3 transactions that you could run that would provide you with all 3 transactions, right? If you queried, the first payment card number, you would get 1 transaction. If you queried the second payment card number, you would get 2 transactions. If you queried the loyalty card number, you would get 2 transactions. So there's no consolidated consumer record that really can be had by querying any of these individual account numbers or loyalty card numbers. Linking solves for that by looking at the overlaps. So it identifies that within transaction 1 and transaction 2, there's an overlap in loyalty and the loyalty account number. And then it identifies that within transaction 2 and transaction 3, there's an overlap in the payment account number. And then because it has identified that 1 and 2 are connected and that 2 and 3 are connected, it can now connect 1, 2, and 3, providing that consolidated consumer view that will include your persistent mobile wallet tokens. So this example relied on some overlaps in loyalty card, but overlaps of really any identifiable feature in a transaction can be used to create this consolidated consumer record. So that can include things like your payment cards, your mobile wallet tokens, loyalty, even gift cards, different types of identifications. So, we do see these a lot in returns, driver's licenses, state IDs. Gift card purchases and redemptions, anything that can be used to identify a consumer within the context of a transaction. Insofar as our overall takeaways, what we're seeing is that our non-cash payments are increasing. Our digital payments, our mobile wallets are increasing. We are finding that our token is persistent across these transactions, but that the account record is now essentially split between two tokens. So what we're finding is that our token tracking mechanisms, they still work with both contactless and contact payments, but they do require us to deploy some of those linking technologies to be able to see a consolidated view of a consumer. We think the full impact of this is still to be decided, but it is still possible for us to do some consolidations of these behaviors.